If you're anything like I am, you've most likely been flooded with a bunch of nostalgic videos on TikTok or maybe Instagram Reels. Some might show a room seemingly trapped in 2007 with aquamice and Frutiger Metro style binders, and others an incredibly obscure niche aesthetic you aren't even sure ever existed. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at some of these popular and even rare aesthetics from the 2000s, starting off with the basics and gradually getting more obscure. See how many you recognise along the way. Out of the more well-known aesthetics from the 2000s, Frutiger Aero is right at the top. Recently, it has seen a resurgence in popularity, mostly due to the people that grew up with it becoming old enough to feel nostalgic for it. Artistically, it can be captured by the use of bubbles, gradients, vibrant blues and greens, and glossy textures. Notably, it was named after Adrian Frutiger, who created most of the initial fonts used with the style. While mostly a visual medium, driven by corporations to freshen up their UI design, it has largely become associated with music from the Wii menu screens, liquid drum and bass, and other genres. The song you'll most commonly see associated with Frutiger Aero is Lease by Takeshi Abo. Being incredibly broad, Frutiger Aero has been subdivided into countless categories, some of which being covered later in this video, in attempts to organise and make sense of the aesthetic. Through this, I would say the core idea that keeps the genre consistent is futurism. There is a focus on sleekness and idealism, reflecting optimism about the future and excitement for the rapid technological developments of the time. This contrasts aesthetics like Vaporwave, which mostly look back at a nostalgic vision of the 80s and 90s. Additionally, the heavy, eco-futuristic themes are why many consider Frutiger Aero the future we were promised but never got. Frutiger also crept outside of digital design, influencing packaging and products at large. I already know you've done a puzzle like this, washed your hands with this soap at least once, or been mesmerised before by one of these lamps. Given its focus on water, Frutiger Aero would often be used to style bathrooms. This led to some cool shower curtains and some very unorthodox toilet designs. I'm honestly not sure how many people ever actually had these. I know I really wanted one and still kind of do, but you definitely don't see companies pushing this kind of stuff anymore. Moving out of the bathroom, other good examples include some of the iMac G3s, with the bulbous blue back half and rounded shape. Another thing I've seen people go crazy for recently are these aquamice, some now going for ridiculous prices on eBay. You may even recall Frutiger Aero from some of the media you watched in the 2000s. Maybe it was the eco-futuristic city seen in Meet the Robinsons, or some of the scenery in the B-movie. Importantly, Frutiger Aero is far from dead, making the rounds on social media and even influencing modern designs, like this board game from 2021. The same can be said for the next aesthetic, which has an even bigger chokehold on society. Y2K refers to the literal year 2000 and also the dominant tech and fashion aesthetic from the time. Prominent in the 90s up to the early 2000s, it came just before the mainstream adoption of Frutiger Aero. Again, as the term Y2K encompasses such a broad range of categories, we'll be looking at the aesthetic styles it is most commonly equated to, which, to be more specific, include cybercore, Y2K futurism, or Y3K. These terms are relatively interchangeable, and all fall under the umbrella of what you might recognise as the Y2K aesthetic. Opposing Frutiger Aero, which utilised the increasing availability of clean, high-definition images, Y2K is associated with more primitive 3D icons and objects. Designs would feature chrome, darker pinks and purples, and glossy white and black lines. Having a similar focus on futurism to Frutiger Aero, it was often portrayed in a more unruly and chaotic sense. You might notice less order and connections to nature in these designs, although there are still shared elements like water. Looking at cybercore specifically, originating in the UK rave scene in the early 1990s, you might notice its affinity for blob-like or distorted spherical shapes. A good example of this can be found in a couple shots of Sharkboy and Lava Girl, especially in this scene with the dark chrome blobs and rocket ship. Much like Frutiger Aero, this aesthetic was often absurdist and surreal, perhaps even unintentionally. A perfect example of this is the Windows ME media player, a giant green head with extending ears that would reveal the volume and song options. This Xbox theme, released for Windows XP, is another, being just the right amount of ridiculous and functional. Its focus on warped, blob-like objects also seeped into the architecture of the early 2000s. Creatively called blobism, buildings like, well, the Blob in the Netherlands would begin spawning around the globe, aiming to reflect the current conception of the future. Moving to handheld devices, a lot of phones and music players took inspiration from the aesthetic as well. I remember owning an iRiver, an MP3 player that perfectly captures many of its core elements in its button and interface design. Certain fonts are also heavily linked with Y2K aesthetics, like Euphoric or Contour. Again, there is a focus on futurism, with characters and letters that wouldn't look out of place in Cyberpunk 2077. Overall, the aesthetics encompassed by the term Y2K would be superseded by Frutiger Aero around 2004. While both would slowly drift out of the mainstream, they have seen a recent resurgence that is due in part to a focus on niche, micro-aesthetics derived from both. And these get pretty weird. Dark Aero, or Frutiger Ego, became popular a while after Frutiger Aero and served as an alternative. Leaving the eco-futuristic themes behind, nature was removed entirely from its designs. The focus, instead, was on sleek, dark and refined electronics. This contributed to a visual style that felt less cluttered than Aero, complementing its use in high-end technology and interfaces at the time. Some of its elements can be seen in the menu screen from Need for Speed Carbon and this advertisement for the Pontiac G8. Overlapping with both Y2K and Frutiger Aero, McBling was an aesthetic that was popular from 2000 to around 2008. Iconography typically referenced flip phones, bedazzled flip phones, jewellery, and websites like MySpace. Pink, purple, silver and gold were the main colours used, often in the form of stick-on stones people would use to decorate their Nokias. Notably, you can see a lot of these elements in shows like Pimp My Ride, especially in some of the cars' interiors. Today, due to its renewed popularity, much of the fashion associated with this aesthetic has received a level of attention on apps like Depop and TikTok that it hasn't seen since 2008. Weirdcore, unlike some of the other aesthetics in this video, is more of an interpretation of 2000s imagery, given meaning in more recent years. Artistically, it is overwhelmingly influenced by the visuals of early 90s to 2000s internet. As a result, you can find elements of every notable 2000s aesthetic in its imagery. Weirdcore is hard to define specifically, but almost always aims to create feelings of nostalgia, dread, confusion, or alienation. In this way, it's largely similar to liminal spaces, although it makes use of significantly more photoshopped elements and text to play into its more surreal themes. A lot of these images feel like the sort of scenarios you come across in your dreams, vaguely familiar locations and people, but still distant enough to elicit that weird, uncomfortable feeling when you wake. I feel like a lot of these are simply speaking to people's desire to reconnect with their youth in some way, especially considering that many show abandoned children's rooms or birthday parties. The main difference between Weirdcore and similar aesthetics like Dreamcore is that where they simply seek to represent certain memories and let the viewer interpret the image themselves, Weirdcore uses text and additional editing to provoke specific feelings like dread or confusion. Take for example this popular image, which is made much more sinister by the blacked out people seated around the table. Or even this photo, which hints at loss likely experienced when someone was very young. Overall, the 2000s was a fascinating time for corporate and internet aesthetics. The focus on futurism, innovation and technology led to a lot of unique designs and subgenres that provide a stark contrast to the minimalism that dominates the current day. Perhaps people gave up on the eco-futuristic vision shown by Frutiger Aero, or the surrealist chrome-plated future painted by Y2K. Maybe companies just realised they didn't need to innovate anymore to keep customers. Whatever the case, thanks for watching the video. Feel free to leave a like if you enjoyed, or a dislike if otherwise, and consider subscribing if you like this kind of content. As always, this has been Extraman, and I'll see you in the next one.
I wish it was 2006. I wish it was 2006. I wish it was 2006. I wish